If you are starting a vertical farm and don't know where to begin or which technology would suit your needs, then reach out to the experts at Cultivated. As indoor farm brokers, they help connect you to the right technology and ensure your project is successful. Best of all, their service is free because they work on behalf of their partners. Visit cultivated.com to learn more. And that's spelled cultivatd.com, or click the link in the show notes.
And that's really when it got me, started thinking that, maybe if I start with a different crop that can overcome all of these hurdles that the leafy green companies have faced, maybe there is a viable business model, a company, an interesting business model that's not just about, being a cent cheaper than competitors, but, something more exciting.
Welcome to the Vertical Farming Podcast, weekly conversations with fascinating CEOs, founders, and ag-tech visionaries. Join us every week as we dive deep into the world of vertical farming with your host, Harry Duran.
Vertical Farming Podcast, Season 3, welcome back. First-time listeners, you are in the right place if you're looking for conversations with fascinating CEOs and founders of the leading vertical farming companies from around the world, or might I say controlled indoor agriculture. The names keep changing, but the mission stays the same. Find stories from folks who are doing great things in this industry that I'm learning more about each and every day. So I appreciate you taking the journey with me. In case you missed last week's episode, we had a great and fun conversation with Charlie Guy. He's the CEO and co-founder of Let Us Grow. And having connected with Charlie in the early days of the podcast, it was great to finally get some time on the calendar with him. Make sure you check that out. This week is a long-anticipated interview with the CEO and co-founder at Oishii Berry, Hiroki Koga. Oishii's been making a lot of waves recently, and it's no surprise to anyone in the vertical farm industry that they're doing something really interesting, specifically with strawberries and their Omakase variety. Currently, a pack of 8 large Omakase berries is going for $50 on the Oishii website, and it's only limited to New York City. So talk about supply and demand and scarcity and confidence in building a quality product. This ticks off all of those. And as you listen to this interview, you'll discover why. It was a really, really interesting conversation with Hiroki. What they do at Oishii is grow the best fruit in the world by deploying groundbreaking vertical farming technology that is pushing the bounds of agriculture. Today, Oishii and I talk about the origin story, naturally. I'm always curious about that, and how they became the first in the world to grow strawberries in an indoor vertical farm at commercial scale. Hiroki reflects on the lessons he's learned throughout his entrepreneurial journey, with a shout out to those who have influenced and inspired him, and talks about the importance he places on living up to the quality and standards of the Oishii brand. And more specifically, as you hear the conversation, it's also a reference and a reverence for the Japanese culture and the craftsmanship that goes into growing a strawberry, which I found fascinating. And finally, Hiroki shares his excitement for future expansion of the business and what excites him most about the future of Oishii and the industry. This episode is also brought to you by Indoor AgCon. Whether you're starting up or scaling up, Indoor AgCon can help you grow your vertical farming business. Live and in person this year, the premier trade show conference for vertical farming and controlled environment agriculture heads to Hilton, Orlando from October 4th through 5th. You can explore an expo filled with new product releases and business solutions, attend idea-packed educational sessions led by top CEOs and thought leaders, and connect with peers and potential business partners at their networking events. Learn more and take advantage of early bird registration discounts at indoor.ag. And you can save an additional $100 off registration with our promo code VFPOD2021. And we'll have those links in the show notes as well. Don't forget to sign up for our Vertical Farming Weekly newsletter at verticalfarmingweekly.com. We'll bring you the latest and greatest in the world of vertical farming, brought to you by our awesome editor, Daniel. Okay, just a little bit more housekeeping before we get into the interview. If you enjoyed this episode or past episodes, I know I sound like a broken record, but I'd love it if you leave a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/VFP. If you've been listening for past seasons or just are new to this season, it's a great way to let me know what you think about the show and anything I could improve or anything you're looking forward to or guests you'd like to hear on this show as well. All right, enough of that. Let's get into this conversation with Hiroki. So Hiroki Koga, co-founder and CEO at Oishii, thank you so much for joining me on the Vertical Farming Podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm a big fan of this podcast, and I think you guys are doing a great job, really, educating people who's in this industry, but also outside of the industry. And I've been able to personally learn a lot, just being able to hear opinions from leaders in the same space. So thank you. I'm really grateful.
I appreciate that. And it's always valuable as a podcaster when you can speak to someone who's actually listened to your show, because as you might imagine, as a creator, you're always wondering, you're creating content, putting it out into the ether, and you're wondering, is anyone listening to it? Painters, artists, writers, we all want to know, like, we're creating something. Is it adding value to anyone, or should I keep doing this? So
Sure.
is for you in early days, is there anything that you would call a hobby or passion that you remember from like your youth that put you in the creator category?
In the creator category, you know what? I grew up in a normal family in Japan, and none of my family members were engineers nor really artists. So I don't specifically recall, any scenes where I would see myself as a very creative person. But one thing in my childhood that really affected my career path was my experience of living in Europe for a few years when I was a kid. And other than that, I spent most of my time in Japan. But during those few years, I had the chance to, go outside of Japan and kind of see Japan from the outside, and really think about my identity as a Japanese. And when you think about other students who are in that international school coming from all different countries, and Japan kind of had this unique position of having companies like Toyota, Sony, and then like things like Pokemon or Dragon Ball in my generation. So we had a lot of unique assets. And so as a kid, I kind of grew up thinking, wow, my country has lots of cool things that I can be proud of. And, this idea of, being able to share something that Japan is good at with the rest of the world was kind of something that always, stuck at the back of my head. And so I didn't know specifically what it was going to be. But, obviously I didn't think it was going to be, strawberries at that time. But I think that was the biggest impact from my childhood to, what I'm doing right now today.
It seems like from what I've seen on like your early schooling that you had a passion for, business, economics, you've got your MBA at Berkeley. What was it about those topics that was attractive to you?
Well, so, I guess I was always trying to look for what my passion in life was. And because I didn't major in engineering or, bioscience or anything like that, I kind of struggled to find what I was truly passionate about when I graduated from college. And, I went into consulting to try to find my passion. Because, when you're in consulting, you get to experience a lot of different industries, a lot of different services. So I thought, if I go into consulting, maybe I can find my passion. And, it actually worked out for me. And so during my 6 years of consulting life at Deloitte in Japan, I came across agriculture related projects. And one of them was vertical farming projects in the early 2000s. So this was when it first took off in Japan before it took off anywhere else in the world. And then so that kind of became a passion. And then I had the chance to, come to the US to do my MBA. I didn't plan to become an entrepreneur, but, a lot of things just happened in the right time. And, I was an expert in the industry, and this industry was taking off here in the US at the right time. So, I decided to take that opportunity and start this company.
Are you familiar with, its origins come from Japan, but the concept of ikigai?
Yes, purpose of life.
And it's something that I've been thinking about recently, because I think I'm going to butcher this and I'll probably have to look it up, but like what you're good at, what you're passionate about, and it's a convergence of all those things. And so as you were speaking about that, it's something that I've been thinking of recently myself, because I think there's things that we love and things that we're good at and things that people will pay us for. But I think when you find the convergence of all those together, it really lights you up and it gives you a purpose in life. So I'm wondering if those are some of sort of like the questions you were struggling with as you were having those internal conversations with yourself.
Exactly, because until I came into this industry, I didn't know what my ikigai was. And I had a good sense that maybe, agriculture and vertical farming is something that I'm interested in when I first came into consulting and, did one of those projects. But it really became something that I was really sure about after I spent more years here in the US during my MBA, looking at this industry closely as an investor and also as a consultant.
What was your initial thoughts, impact, experience coming to the US for the first time?
That's a very interesting question. So a lot of cultural shocks for sure. I could speak English, but I only spent a few years in elementary school and American school, so that was all I knew about the U.S. And this was not even in the U.S. It was in an American school in Paris, in France. So I had no idea what the U.S. would be like. But one of the biggest things that I realized when I first arrived to the Bay Area was the difference in the quality of produce in general. Compared to what I was used to eating in Japan. Because as a kid growing up in Japan, everyone is taught that United States is the world's largest agriculture producer. Yeah. And so I'd assume everything would be cheaper and better. And, even though now that I know that California has one of the freshest and the most high quality produce in the country, but, I didn't even know that. And, I still thought that the quality was surprisingly different from what I was used to eating in Japan, because in Japan we have extremely high quality produce and a very sophisticated distribution channel, and the country itself is just the size of California. So for sure. Most produce can go from farm to table in a day, and so it's always fresh and it's always high quality. And so that was just one thing that really kind of caught me off guard, but it was a good insight that really got me thinking, maybe there is something that I can do here in the US using my experience.
What were some of the things you were discovering when you were at Deloitte and you started your introduction to the vertical farming industry, seeing what work had been done up until that point, and then, I would imagine having your consultant hat on, figuring out where are there gaps, where are there rooms for improvement, and, what was your vision of what could be possible at that time?
Sure. So I think the vertical farming industry itself, well, first of all, there were no such term as vertical farming back then. People called it, plant factories, indoor agriculture. It's very inconsistent. But so the whole idea of growing crops using LEDs in a completely closed and controlled environment, I think took off in Japan in the late 90s and early 2000s. And these were mostly led by large Japanese electronics companies like Panasonic, Sharp, Toshiba, who had all of the equipments and the devices to make this happen, right? So it wasn't really driven by the market demand, but it was driven more on the technology side of things. And, these companies wanted to do something cool and new, right? But what happened was, even though they figured out how to grow lettuces and other types of leafy greens in a vertical farm setup, they quickly came to realize that it's not a viable business model because they were just spending too much money up front on the capex, and the end product was fresh and good, but fresh and quality vegetable is always available in Japan, so no one would pay any premium for these vertically farmed lettuces. So every time I worked with a client, the problem was always about how do we reduce cost, because you cannot demand much of a higher premium. And the more I looked into, different projects, I've seen probably 30, 40 companies, their BS and their P&L, and everyone had a very similar business structure. And I just struggled so much as a consultant because I just couldn't find a way to really justify this business to be a profitable one. And so what really happened was, after 10 years, the first, few years, people are really fascinated about the technology because it was so futuristic and,
sure.
Sci-fi and, this is so cool.
The robots.
Exactly. But then, after a lot of companies got into the space, they said, okay, this doesn't make sense. We're going to get out of the space. So what happened was it was known as an industry that was cool, but that just didn't make sense as a business. And so that's kind of when I left Japan and then went to the US to do my MBA in about 2015. And so, I had spent enough time in the vertical farm space to really know about the business in depth, but I hadn't really developed a perfect thesis on where this industry was going. And it was kind of lingering in the back of my head as I moved to the US. But then, in 2015, as you probably remember, I think a lot of startups started raising money here in the US, outside of Japan. And it was really driven by a completely different force. And it was more around demand for fresh produce, but also demand for a more sustainable way to grow crops. And so I think, people started thinking that the environment that's surrounding agriculture is changing very quickly, and all of the resources that used to be almost free are now no longer free. And, the weather is very unstable. So it became a general consensus that, something had to happen in agriculture, just like how, people are seeing the shift from traditional cars to electric vehicles. And so a lot of investment started going into this field. And what happened was, because it was such an emerging industry and there was almost no one in the US who has been doing this for many years, somehow people found me on LinkedIn, and a lot of VCs and consultants, asked me if I could help them conduct due diligences on the financial models and also the business model, and even to the extent of, technology assessment, because I'd been to so many vertical farms in Japan that were, a few years ahead of what these people are trying to do here in the US. And so, I kind of got to see both the Japanese market that kind of failed, and then the emerging market in the US that was driven by a completely different type of force, but they were all, using relatively similar technology. And that really helped me, think through where this whole industry was going and what it takes to succeed in this industry.
So around 2015, 2016, you also began to work with the folks at AgFunder as well. Is that right?
Yeah, so I was an MBA intern at AgFunder. I also interned at several other VCs who are looking into this space.
Do you feel like the time at AgFunder gave you sort of another perspective, another front seat to seeing what was happening in the industry? Because obviously, like, they're closely tied to what's happening in controlled environment agriculture, and maybe you just got to see more of what was happening.
Yeah, so to be honest, I think at that point AgFunder was much smaller than what they are today, and I think they were also trying to figure out where their sweet spot was. So there wasn't a lot of structure to it, and they basically just assigned me to multiple deals around for what it was vertical farming operators, but there were also equipment companies, LED companies, all of these random deals that were coming through their platform. So I could kind of see that there is definitely an increasing amount of interest in the space, and I could feel that firsthand, because until then it was really just Japan who was doing this.
So now that brings us to the idea for Oishii. So this is like now late 2016. Talk to me about what's going through your mind at this time, because you're seeing all these experiences, what's happened in Japan, you've seen the money coming in, so it feels like all these Lego blocks are starting to be formed. And
Yes.
So I'm curious, like, how what your thought process is as you start to think about what would eventually become the early days of Oishii.
So, one interesting incident that happened during my time at Berkeley was, so I was chatting with one of the investors who wanted to invest in this space. And, they were really trying to figure out so they were trying to invest in a vertical farm operator, right? And they were talking to many different leafy green companies, and they just couldn't make a decision on who was going to win in the space because the technology seemed very similar. And everyone says, they have something that is new, but, based on my experience, almost at that point, almost everything that went into the leafy green space was somewhat, commoditized technology. And it wasn't, there was no really secret sauce to growing these leafy greens. And so I couldn't recommend him, a single, that this company was definitely going to, be better than the others. And so where we kind of ended up was, when we think about 10 years, 20 years out, who's going to succeed in the leafy green space is the company who can raise the most amount of money and who can produce a head of lettuce 1 cent cheaper than the competitors, because it's really hard to create differences in the flavor. And the products were already pretty good. So, and it's really hard to brand a head of lettuce in a supermarket. So it was all about how efficiently and how quickly can you scale the business model. And it wasn't really about the technology, because at the end of the day, it's going to become a commoditized technology pretty quickly.
It's hard to convince the consumer of the differences. I mean, the average consumer could probably tell you 3 or maybe 4 types of different lettuce. There's romaine, iceberg, bib. I don't know, maybe,
Yes.
at that point you start getting into like the fancier varieties. But from a taste perspective, to your point as well, there's a law of diminishing returns at some point where you're just like, it's, as a consumer, they're thinking, well, it's going in a salad anyway. So it's not like I'm like tasting each leaf of lettuce as it's being eaten, and I have a discerning. And you also have to accommodate for people's palates. Like most people's palates
Exactly.
are not refined, so to speak.
Exactly. So our conclusion was that, the winner of this space is going to be the person who's going to be able to raise that kind of money. So, that was the interim solution. But then, so I started thinking, okay, that was not a thesis that I was expecting, or, where I wanted this answer to come out. And so, I started thinking and took that question and took it a little bit one step further and thought, okay, who is going to become the largest vertical farm player, beyond leafy greens? Like, let's assume that, there's a way to grow crops beyond leafy greens.
Sure.
And then what does the end game look like? And that's really when it got me, started thinking that, maybe if I start with a different crop that can overcome all of these hurdles that the leafy green companies have faced, maybe there is a viable business model, a company, an interesting business model that's not just about, being a cent cheaper than competitors, but, something more exciting, right? And so when I thought about what did not go well in Japan, there were 3 things. One was, first of all, it was extremely hard to make profit with these products in Japan, especially because the competing products or the conventional products were already pretty good. And so because people could not generate cash flow, positive cash flow, people had to keep on raising equity financing. And it's really tough to keep on building large facilities on equity finance. And so, until you generate positive cash flow, you can't really quickly scale the business. So I thought that was one big problem. So I thought, if I'm starting this business, I need to start with something that can generate positive cash flow from the first facility, so we can prove to investors and bring in more money and scale very quickly. And the second thing was, everyone is selling leafy greens. So, I need to start selling something beyond leafy greens. And then also, let's start with something that is really challenging. But if we unlock that crop, we might be able to unlock a lot of different crops. So that was, the second point. Let's start with something that's hard. And then the last point, which was really critical for me, especially when I thought about, the long-term game, like 10 years, 20 years out, it was really about something that could be branded. Because at the end of the day, even beyond leafy greens, I think the technology will become obsolete. So even, strawberries and tomatoes, in 20, 30 years, I think everyone in this space is going to be able to grow these crops. And at that point, what's really going to differentiate, a successful company from the others is brand. And this was very clear to me, especially, as we were seeing, how Tesla was scaling their business. And it was interesting because one of the articles that wrote about us kind of used that analogy and, compared us to how we're expanding our business, banking on branding, just like how Tesla successfully branded their product. Because when you think about electric vehicles, in 2010, I think, besides Tesla, there were a few other companies who were in this space. So like Nissan had Nissan Leaf. It's kind of funny that the name was Leaf, but
yeah, I actually test drove a Nissan Leaf years ago.
Yeah, but the biggest difference between those two products was that Nissan Leaf was a sustainable product, but in terms of the quality of the product, it wasn't that much better than what was already out there. It was cheaper, it was much more affordable, but nothing really surprised people beyond the fact that it was running on electricity. But what Tesla did was they blew people's mind with a product that is sustainable, but also much superior to what was available in the market. They were faster than a Porsche, right? And even though they could only produce, I don't know how many, maybe like 1,000 or 2,000 cars every year, and most people couldn't even buy those cars, and people went crazy about it just because of the difference in the product quality. And what's helping them today is that, amazing brand experience. And now, they're coming down to Model 3, and, there are probably 20, 30 other automotive companies that have similar products, but because Tesla built that very strong brand and an image of a leader within that industry 10 years ago, that's why they're able to demand a premium today. And I thought the exact same thing was going to happen in this industry, 5-10 years ago. And that's why, I thought we have to start with something that was truly differentiated, something that we can build a strong brand with. And my answer was strawberries, and in particular, Japanese varietal strawberries.
Lots of things to unpack there. Something you said was that you wanted to tackle this problem because it was hard.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that mindset, that ethos, that work ethic, where does that come from?
So I think the reason why I wanted to start with something hard was because a lot of the companies that started a business in the vertical farm space started with something that is easy, that they can sell tomorrow, and instead of focusing on, what comes beyond that. So I really thought that, if we had the chance to raise significant amount of funding, it's probably the wisest thing to do is to spend all of that money onto the next thing, while other people are focusing on, the more immediate crops. And so that was kind of the thinking behind everything. And then also, growing up as a kid in Japan, strawberry is the king of crops in Japan. And it's where all of the farmers want to end up in their career. People start with leafy greens, easier product, but crops like tomatoes and strawberries are where, you can really put your, all of the learnings that you've learned as a farmer for, 20, 30 years, and really adjust all of the environment, adjust the way you grow them. And everyone has their proprietary way to grow strawberries. And, they want to brag about the quality of their strawberries, how they're superior to anything else that's, available in the market. So it's like a farmer's dream crop. And that's kind of, what inspired me, and, why I thought, maybe if we can start with this crop and really conquer this crop, everything else should be much easier.
So in Japan, are they recognized, certain brands in terms of strawberries, or certain farms that these taste different than these others?
So this might be a little bit unbelievable, but in Japan, Japan has also states. So we call them prefectures, but every prefecture has their own strawberry breeding program, and they're competing against each other. Right. And so Japan owns more than 250 different varieties of strawberries. And this is more than majority of the entire strawberry cultivars that's available on this planet. But it's really a competitive market. And, if you have any Japanese friends, I'd encourage you to ask them if they can name certain brands of strawberries. And I guarantee they can name at least 3 or 4 that they like. So
what are some of your favorites?
I actually have so many. So the most typical one is called Tochiotome. And so these are very popular because the patent is already expired and any farmer can grow them. But one of the most popular ones are called Amao, which is grown in the southern part of Japan. And it's only grown in this, specific prefecture in Japan. And I think that's one of the people's favorite these days. But, if you go to supermarkets, and what it says on the package is not strawberries, it has the brand's name on it. So I think in this country, people recognize Driscoll's and, maybe 1 or 2 other brands, but in Japan, I think it's much more relevant to people when, they talk about brands of strawberries.
It almost sounds like wines come to mind, like
Yes.
like the Bordeaux region or Champagne. Like you're talking about where it was grown, and everything that's inherent in that culture makes up like how that tastes.
Very, very similar. So I think we have a very interesting culture when it comes to fruits. So instead of gifting wines, people would gift fruits. And if you go to department stores, there will always be a section where they have very expensive fruits that is grown in a certain way. And they'll have stories behind, how it was grown, who grew them, why it's so good. And, people would gift them to their friends and families. And, if you're the recipient of the gift, you would really, read everything that's in that box and try to understand what it is and really appreciate where it came from.
The more you talk about it, the more it makes sense that this is where you would end up, because this is the culture where something like a fruit and strawberries was prized. So when did you realize that this was an opportunity in this industry, and then that coupled with you being the person that wants to bring this forward?
Sure. So right after I came to the US, I clearly saw a huge opportunity in growing, quality vegetables and produce or fruits here in the US. And, strawberries was obviously, one of the top that was on my mind. And so when I started thinking about, starting Oishii, the first thing that I did was I got an importer license for strawberries. And because I didn't have money to build a whole vertical farm here, I decided to buy a bunch of high quality strawberries in Japan and basically packed my entire suitcase and flew to New York. So at that point, it was just myself and my co-founder, Brendan. So we filled our bags with strawberries. We found a hotel that had a full-size fridge in Manhattan. We filled the entire fridge with Japanese strawberries. And then we spent the next 3 days, literally going from the bottom of Manhattan, walking all the way up to, around Central Park, just knocking on doors of restaurants and supermarkets and people, who would be our future customer, just to get their reaction. If we were to sell these strawberries throughout the year and you had access to these strawberries, how much would you pay? And, how many of these berries would you buy? And the reaction was just really overwhelmingly positive. And so that was really the moment we knew that this was something that could take off if we could figure out how to grow them in a vertical farm.
How many strawberries are we talking about that you put on the plane?
I don't know, probably a couple thousand or a few thousand strawberries. And I mean, yeah, we've probably visited more than 40, 50 restaurants and hotels and retail buyers in a matter of 4 days. So yeah, we just did cold calls on to all of these Michelin restaurants in Manhattan.
Yeah, I spoke to Rob Lang of Farm One, and he had a similar experience because he went straight
yes.
towards the high end herbs, and went straight to like the Michelin restaurants, and that's where he was able to make inroads early as well.
I heard his episode, and I was actually impressed that he was able to bring those chefs convince those chefs to come to his farm, because when we first did our cold calls, like no one was willing to meet us. Like we would show up at the front desk and ask for the chef, and the receptionist will ask us if we had an appointment, and we said no. And they're like, well, like you have to send an email, you have to call us, but we only had 3 days and we didn't have that time. So we kind of had to figure out a way to just get into the kitchen. So eventually, what Brandon and I kind of figured out, I'm not sure if this is something that I should share on a podcast, but we at one point we had to kind of lie at the reception and say, yes, we have an appointment with the chef, and he told me to come into the kitchen. So that's how we got into the kitchens. And then when the chefs come out and they see the strawberries, it's just like visually, it's just nothing like they've seen before. They're shining, and they're already the fragrance is already filling up the room. So even though if we didn't have an appointment, they'll be intrigued because they're craftsmen and artisans. So they're like, okay, just give me one berry, I'll give you my opinion. And then once they bite into the strawberry, their facial expression, like you can tell that they're just blown away. And so some people are like, I want this from tomorrow. How many can you bring? It was as easy as that. Once you can get the berries into their mouths.
Yeah, and it's very common. I think it might be a cultural difference, but just salespeople know that sometimes you have to try any way you can to get, because these people are just gatekeepers at the front, and they're trying to respect the chef's time.
Exactly.
But I think you knew in your heart that what you were providing was something that they would find interesting, valuable, and something as artisans, as creators themselves, to your point, would appreciate as well, as in terms of like something they haven't seen before. And, I could probably ask a bunch of other questions about how you packed them to make sure they didn't get damaged and all that sort of stuff. But that's a really, really fun story. Thank you for sharing that. So now you've figured out you have something here. People are interested. Now talk about formation of Oishii, and then early days about what's the strategy, because you could have gone the route as anyone else did. Here's our product, begin offering it. But I think, being in stealth for so long, I'm assuming that was part of the strategy as well. So talk a little bit about what your thinking there was.
So in my second year of MBA, I decided to start this company. And so especially after I've seen these reactions from the chefs, I knew that, as long as I could figure out a way to grow these strawberries in a vertical farm, I would have a pretty solid, revenue and P&L business model overall. So the next thing I did was, using all of my network during my time at Deloitte, I contacted a lot of expert farmers in Japan who's been, trying to do something similar in the indoor agriculture space. And then also we partnered with a lot of leading universities in Japan who were mostly funded by these, thanks to these electronic company giants who's been basically, dumping money into these universities. So research was, going on, even though the industry didn't take off quite well. So, we did a lot of open innovation initiatives, and we brought all of these bits and pieces from different universities and from different farms together to really figure out end to end, how can we grow strawberries from, seedling all the way to, going through flowering stage, making sure that they produce enough flowers and the flowers have enough pollens. And then, we can operate bees effectively to conduct pollination, and the end product actually tastes good, right? So there were so many different challenges in each of these stages, which you cannot see in a leafy green product because they have a much shorter, 30-day cycle. Whereas for strawberries, they have, if you go from seed all the way to production, you're looking at like a 10-month growth cycle. And there are different, very distinct different cycles of the plant where you have to change environments, you have to do different things all the time. So, we had help from the Japanese community a lot. And we figured out how to grow strawberries in the farm in about, I would say, a year after we incorporated in 2016. So in 2017, we raised a small seed round under stealth mode. These were mostly angel investors from the US and also back in Japan. And we built a very small prototype to prove that we can grow strawberries in a vertical farm. It worked, and the quality was phenomenal. And so we started using those to start talking to chefs and, get commitments for their sales if we were to expand our facility.
And then now, as you think, because you have to wear all the hats as an entrepreneur, as you've very well experienced. So you've got to be thinking about expenses. You got to think about marketing. You got to think about sales. You've got to think about all the different things that, as you grow, you can hire people to do that. So putting on your marketing hat, what did you want to do different with Oishii than what you had seen previously?
Yes. So I think the most important thing for us was not the early revenue, but making sure that we live up to the quality and the standards of the brand that we wanted to build. So we didn't just, go out and start selling the first harvest. We really perfected the environment, and we really made sure that it's a strawberry that you can just not find in this country. So that was the first thing that we really focused on, quality. And then next, instead of, going straight to the retailers, we wanted to establish a strong brand. So we thought, Michelin restaurant chefs and, these famous chefs, if they could be our spokesperson, that would help us a lot in terms of boosting the brand. And so what we did was we started selling our first product at a restaurant called Chef's Table at Brooklyn Fair in Manhattan. They are one of the 5 3-star restaurants. And the chef there, Cesar Ramirez, is known to be a he's a creator, right? He's a little bit stubborn and difficult person at times, but his standard is really high, and he plates everything onto every single plate by himself. I was just blown away because, at that type of restaurants, usually the head chef is just, someone who's creating the menu, and you let everyone else do the work. But he is just, so proud of what he's doing, and he just cannot let other people handle things. So he was plating everything on his own. And so we thought, this is where we need to start. And, people who dine at those places have a very fine palate. And, a lot of people have been to Japan as well. And so they're familiar with, the quality of the fruit. So we started there. And then, even though we didn't have a lot of supply, we had just enough to start selling at Chef's Table. And the word just spread really quickly. We started getting lots of emails from people who dined there, because the way he used our strawberry was he actually didn't do anything to it. So he just plated one of our berry on a beautiful plate at the end of his, I think, like 14 dish course. And at the end, it was just omakase berries. And so, yeah, I think it was very impactful. And we just started getting a lot of emails. And, that's kind of how we started in terms of selling our product.
Given this is only an audio podcast, we're going to invite the listener to use their other senses. But for people who have not experienced like an omakase berry, like how could you even come close to describing what that and who are just used to, obviously the regular strawberries we've had here in the States for years? How would you compare? How would you describe it?
So the way the chefs describe our strawberries is, first of all, they say that the aroma and the fragrance is just completely different. So if you were to have one tray of our berries and leave it in a room for, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes, anyone who would walk into that room would realize that the room is smelling like a strawberry farm, basically. Actually, even more than a strawberry farm here that you can find in this country. So the aroma is just exceptional. And, considering that 70% of your taste consists of the aroma, that is extremely important. And the other thing is the sweetness. So we have 2 to 3 times more sweetness in our strawberries compared to what's available on the market. And I think the last thing is the texture is very soft and creamy. So it might be hard to imagine, what a creamy strawberry is like, but if you've had Kobe beef and people would say it's very creamy or buttery compared to your traditional steaks, it's a little bit similar to that. It's very soft, and it would not be able to withstand a long distance transportation. But because we can grow it in a vertical farm right next to our consumers, it's full of soft flesh, and that's full of sweetness and aroma.
And now in terms of availability, is it still just in New York, or are you shipping to other locations now?
So right now we're still in just in New York. Well, so precisely speaking, Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn and parts of New Jersey, but we're still limited to this area. But we are getting a lot of inquiries, and probably as we're speaking right now, we're probably getting a couple of emails from people from all over the world, like, when are you going to be expanding? And that's really what we are working on right now. It really hurts me that we have been advertising these things online, but only people who live in New York have access to this. So we have plans to expand into other cities in the US and also outside of the US. I can't share the exact timeline, but we're not talking about 5 years, 10 years out. We're talking about a much closer future.
So to the extent that you can share, what is the plan for growth? And do you see these as satellites operating in other major cities, or how have you thought about this expansion?
Yeah, so in terms of expansion, I think we'll take a relatively similar approach to most of the other larger leafy green vertical farms, which is to build large commercial scale farms next to each major cities around the world. And obviously, we will start with strawberries. We've started with our Omakase berries, which is truly an exceptional quality strawberry. But we've also succeeded in growing our everyday, more affordable strawberries as well. They are still, 2 to 3 times sweeter than what's available. So they're far superior to what's, on the market today. Those will be available relatively soon. So we will have multiple varieties within strawberries. And if you think about, how Tesla went from Roadster to Model S and Model 3, right now we're still in that Roadster stage, but we have, figured out how to do Model S, and we are actually working on the Model 3 right now. So we're looking at a much shorter timeline than, how Tesla went from Roadster to their Model 3. And, even beyond strawberries, we're working on multiple crops. We're definitely going to try to focus on crops that people can really feel and understand the difference in the quality and the flavor. So we're looking at things like tomatoes, melons, and those kind of fruits.
I would imagine if you take the same care and dedication to flavor and quality that you did with strawberries, and you're applying it now to things like tomatoes, because again, that's another crop that when people think of it, it's just, most people here tend to throw it in the refrigerator, which is the worst thing you can do to a tomato, and then they lose the flavor. And, that you get some of that with heirlooms, but it'd be fascinating to see if you apply that sort of craftsmanship to other crops.
Exactly.
Yeah, what's possible.
Exactly. So, we've already seen results from our R&D facility that, some of the varieties of tomatoes that we're growing contain 3 times as much sweetness compared to strawberries.
Wow.
So they're sweeter than, the strawberries that you can find in this country.
So, so you're officially out of stealth now because the whole world knows about
Yes.
what you guys now. So if you had to look back from when you're launched to where you are now, and you're now, starting to make the rounds, talking to people about the story, what's been some lessons and some takeaways for you over the past couple of years?
Lessons and takeaways. Yeah, so I think the biggest lesson that we learned, or, I personally learned as a management of this company, is that when we first started, this industry was so small, and a lot of people were casting doubts about, whether this is even a feasible business. And, I had spent enough time and, I had enough confidence to believe in myself that this was really going to happen. But, but also a part of me was also a little bit conservative. And because I had seen a lot of companies, a lot of smart people fail in this industry. And so when I was planning my strategy, let's say my long-term strategy, 3-4 years ago, I did not have enough mind space to think about what do I have to be doing now that will save me in 5-6 years later, because I was, really focusing on, perfecting the quality and doing what I can do today right, versus, allocating the money and the resources to something in the future. But, running this company for 4 or 5 years now, what I had really learned is, especially for crops like strawberries that take a long time to conduct R&D and then also to breed new varieties, you really need to be, investing that extra, resource into things that will really change the game in 5-6 years out. And so, if I had started our breeding program 4 years ago, we would have been in a much better place than, where we are today. We are already breeding new cultivars, but it takes 3-4 years, right? So I wish I started that a little bit earlier so we could share more, amazing strawberries with the rest of the world. So I think, the way I think about R&D has changed a lot in the past 2 years. And now I have much more confidence in, what we're building. And, the whole, I think, investment ecosystem is becoming more confident in this industry, and there's more money coming into this industry. So I feel like I can, push the Excel button more than 3-4 years ago.
Who do you look to for inspiration as a leader, given this new role that you've stepped in as, at Oishii? And who inspires you, and who do you look to for inspiration?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because this was a question that I've always asked myself the past, 4 years, because it's my first company, and every day I'm dealing with an organization of a size of an organization that I've never run before, right? But, the interesting thing is, after asking this question to myself and trying to, mimic, the way other great leaders have kind of steered their company, it really didn't help me, because at the end of the day, I realized that I'm a different person. And it just really, I think, puts unnecessary pressure on me when I think that, I have to act in a certain way. Like, do I have to be like Elon Musk? Do I have to be like Jeff Bezos? I think, I come to realize that that's not a very healthy way. And instead, because when you're in that mindset, you really try to kind of force yourself to be someone else.
Yeah.
And while it's important to improve your skill set as a management, I realize it's very unhealthy. And what I found to be much more effective is to admit what I'm capable of doing, what I'm good at, what I'm not good at, and be very transparent about it with the team. And, I always tell my colleagues that, I'm, all of the people that we've hired recently, all of the management are much more talented than me in everything that they do. And the only thing that I have confidence in is my passion for this industry and my experience in this industry, and my knowledge and how I think this industry is going to trend. Like that's my strength, right? So these days I try to be a little more relaxed and just try to be myself, be a little more authentic, and instead of trying to be this ideal leader that I think people see as an ideal leader, but that's not necessarily the case.
That makes a lot of sense. What's a tough question you've had to ask yourself recently?
Recently, well, so if you call 1 year ago recent, I think one of the biggest decisions we had to make as a management during COVID, I think very similar to other companies, was do we go into a conservative shelter mode to secure runway and size down the organization, or do we try to keep on hitting all the milestones? And it was really a difficult decision because when COVID hit, we had no idea where this was going to go. And so we discussed a lot. Almost all of our investors told us to size down the company and to secure more runway because everyone was really scared that we might just run out of cash, right? But the more we really started thinking about what does COVID mean to our business, and even though it was a very scary environment, we started to learn that there's actually more opportunities because people are spending more time and money at home, and their awareness towards food and was increasingly getting educated more and more. And we were experiencing much higher demand from consumers who would be dining at Michelin restaurants, but now that they can't dine at Michelin restaurants, they were looking for other ways to spend their money. So instead of sizing the company down, we've decided to basically keep all of our employees, and we doubled down on all of the milestones that we promised to our investors prior to COVID, and we hit all of those milestones, and that's how we were able to raise the next round of funding, which we announced this March. But that was maybe we're just lucky. If I were an experienced serial entrepreneur, maybe the best decision I had to make at that point, given the amount of information I had, was to size down the company. I don't know, but it turned out that it was a good decision that we made, and because of that, we made tremendous progress. And as a matter of fact, the number of our employees tripled in the past 12 months.
Wow.
And revenue more than tripled. So
I think hindsight is 20/20, but you can look back, and if you were able to navigate the company through what is arguably one of the most challenging environments in a century for most business owners, and the fact that you're able to weather that and come out ahead, I think gives you resilience and shows you what's possible and what you're capable of as a leadership team. So I think it sort of gives you that boost of confidence that it almost like if you can make it through COVID, then anything else is probably not going to be as intense. So congratulations.
I'd like to hope so. Thank you.
Well, Hiroki, I really appreciate you sharing your story. It's really entertaining, and I was really looking forward to this conversation. And I'm excited to be sharing it with my audience. And so I appreciate you taking the time, and it's really fascinating to hear what you've built and exciting to see what you have planned for the future in terms of making Oishii a standout company in this space. And I think it's going to be a model that a lot of people are going to be looking at closely and trying to emulate. I don't know how much success they'll have, because it seems like you're definitely a few steps ahead.
I'd like to hope so.
Yeah. And so if people want to learn more, they can go to oishii.com. That's OISHII.com. And the company and the marketing team's active on socials as well.
Yes, I think we make a lot of announcements on our Instagram. So every time we expand our delivery zone, or we expand into a different region, I think that's where we're going to announce everything first. So if you're interested in when your city is going to be within our delivery zone, I think Instagram might be the best place to follow.
Okay, we'll make sure we have all those links in the show notes as well. So thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Harry.
That was so much fun. Such a great conversation with Hiroki. Thanks again, Hiroki, for coming on the show, sharing your story. I know that your time is in demand now that you're out of stealth mode, and a lot of people are starting to experience what Oishii is all about. So grateful for that. Full show notes available at verticalfarmingpodcast.com. Thanks to our Season 3 title sponsor, Cultivated. If you're looking for a vertical farm and don't know where to start or which technology would suit your needs, reach out to them today. Best of all, their service is free because they work on behalf of their partners. Learn more at cultivated.com, and that's spelled cultivatd.com. Just leave out the last E. Indoor AgCon is coming up in October. Learn more and take advantage of early bird registration discounts at indoor.ag and save an additional $100 off with our promo code VFPOD2021. Podcast production and marketing provided by Fullcast. Sign up for a free podcast brainstorm at fullcast.co/VFP15. If you think your company would benefit from a podcast or have questions about starting the process, that's a great opportunity to have a chat with me and my team. As a reminder, if you're enjoying the show, please leave us a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/VFP, and we'll be sure to read those out on future episodes. Join us next episode for my conversation with David Cohen, CEO of Fluence. Until we meet again, here's to your health.
Thanks for listening. To read the full show notes for this episode, which includes any links mentioned in the episode, as well as a full show transcription, visit verticalfarmingpodcast.com. There, you can sign up for our email list to be notified when new episodes are published.